Welcome to my federal government class. My name is Kevin Wooten, and this is the introductory PowerPoint presentation. This presentation will generally reflect everything that I talk about in class, so you may go back and revisit this information as many times as you wish. That's one of the reasons I put it on here. So, uh, so with that, let's begin. Let's start out with some definitions. That kind of helps us have some firm footing in what we're talking about in this class. Government. Government is the formal vehicle which allows for the legitimate use of force to implement policy and control human behavior. One thing we always have to remember is that the whole purpose of government, for the most part, is controlling human behavior. It is telling you what you can and cannot do, how fast you can drive, whether you can steal somebody else's property, whether you have to pay taxes or not. It's always controlling human behavior, and government is the one entity that can legitimately use force, meaning it can make you do something uh, in order to implement the policy that they want to have implemented. So that if you speed, they can give you a ticket and charge, you a fine. If you steal somebody's property, their car, um, whatever, they can put you in jail. If you kill somebody, they can execute you. So they can use force, and they're the only real legitimate entity in our society that is allowed to use force to get what they want. As opposed to government politics is the process by which we choose government officials and what those officials choose or do not choose to do. Politics is just all the processes that happen during in the workings of the government, in the implementation of the government. So politics are what the people we elect do or not to do, because choosing not to do something can also be a policy and part of politics. Ignoring certain problems or not addressing problems that other people might think you should address, that can be considered policy too, and that is part of the political process. Now, all governments have certain purposes. They have reasons for existing, and the number one or most common reason for existing, or the most common purpose for all governments, and it is the oldest purpose of all governments too. Every single government exists for the most part to maintain order. That goes back to controlling human behavior. So maintaining order is the oldest purpose of all governments. The original government that was ever formed by, hypothetically, a cave society. It was probably to control the behavior of a rogue caveman or somebody like that. But it is the oldest purpose of all governments. All governments use their power to control human behavior. They use this power to enforce the rule of law, and generally we do it to protect citizens from each other, because as we know, just by looking around our society today, not everybody lives by the golden rule. Treat others as you want to be treated. There are some that just do not follow the rules and do not follow the uh, the norms of society, and those people have to be dealt with. And that's what government is for: is to protect citizens from each other, and which we'll talk about a little bit later, because that begs the question as to, what is the core at the core of a human. Are they good or bad? Do the rules make them good, or are they good naturally? But we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But anyway, there are always some that do not follow the rules, and that act in a bad way towards others. A philosopher in the 1600s named Thomas Hobbes argued that governments were the purpose of government was to improve on the state of nature, and we'll talk more about the state of nature in a little while as well. But the state of nature is basically a world without government, and it's a world where, according to Hobbes at least, it's not a very pleasant place to be. A little later, another philosopher named John Locke came around, and he argued in his writings that the most important purpose of government was to protect private property. And John Locke, to this day, is still the most important philosopher in with regard to the United States and its government. Because if you, which we'll look at a little bit later, if you look at the Declaration of Independence and you look at how our government is structured, um, most of John Locke's ideas are embedded into our form of government, into the Declaration of Independence, and he has a great, great influence over um, our society. Now, Thomas Hobbes, he wrote a book in 1651 called Leviathan, and in it he just kind of philosophizes over, what the role of government is, and the things it should do, the things it should not do. And basically Hobbes had a very negative perception of human nature. He thought at the core we were all pretty bad people, that if we were left to our own devices with no rules and nothing to constrain us, that we would harm other people. We would take things from other people. We would not treat each other well. And so he believed that government is necessary to restrain human tendencies through enforceable laws. So he's arguing that our tendencies are bad, and those tendencies are to take advantage of other people. If we are stronger or smarter than others, we will use those powers to take advantage of others. He said without government, without the ability to restrain human tendencies through enforceable laws, we would live in a state of nature. And in his writings, he called this state of nature solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Basically, he calls it a 20, 24 hours, 7 days a week. You have a war of man on man. It is a constant struggle to survive. There is nothing you can do to stop somebody stronger or smarter from taking what you have, be it your property, your family, your life, because there are no governments and there are no rules. So therefore, you can't say you can't do that to me. You can't take my property. You can't say that because there are no governments and there are no rules. There's no entity or no ability to enforce societal norms. So solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's a good way to define what a world would be like with no rules. It would be anarchy. So because of this, we recognize as humans that we can't live in a society like that. So we agree as a society, as a community, we agree to be ruled by a strong single leader who is given the power to control base human behavior. Okay, so basically, in order to ensure our safety and security, in order to ensure that we can just survive, according to Hobbes, we need a single strong ruler who can put into place rules and enforce those rules. And he said, Hobbes says, you have no right to question this ruler. You have no right to question anything he does because, or her, uh, anything he or her does, because anything, no matter how, according to Hobbes, no matter how brutal or how uh, uh, rigid the rules are, anything is better than the state of nature. So if you question the ruler, you might end up back in the state of nature. If you challenge the ruler or try to overthrow the ruler, you might end up in the state of nature, which is the absolute worst place to be. And this is a lot of people. Hobbes loses a lot of people when he starts talking about this idea of no matter how brutal the leader is, or no matter how arbitrary the rules are, that you shouldn't question him. But look at it this way. Let's do a comparison. Let's say, think back to Saddam Hussein, who was the leader of Iraq before the war in 2003, and he was captured and executed. But prior to that, he was the leader of Iraq, and most everybody argues that he wasn't a nice person. He was a um, pretty bad guy, and he executed and tortured and many of his people, and you really, really had to walk a thin line with him because if you said anything wrong or you did anything wrong, well, he just had the arbitrary power to just take care of you. But according to Hobbes, living in a world like that is better than living in the state of nature. Living under a brutal dictator like Saddam Hussein is better than the state of nature, because at least you know, under Saddam Hussein, at least you know the rules. You know that if you don't speak out against Saddam, if you just keep your head down and go to work and go to school and do what you're supposed to do in that society, you, for the most part, would be safe. So in a society like that with a brutal dictator, just follow the rules, because there are rules. Of course, in the state of nature, there are no rules to follow at all. There is absolutely nothing you can do to ensure your own safety, because there's no rules and there's nobody to enforce any rules. So that is why Hobbes believed that any leader, no matter how arbitrary or how brutal, is better than the state of nature. And he also, and because of that, he had a negative attitude towards human nature. He thought we were all bad and we needed this control. John Locke, on the other hand, who wrote a work called The Second Treatise on Civil Government in 1689, had a little more optimistic view of human behavior. He understood the need for laws. He understood that we needed governments to control human behavior. But he also argued that there were certain natural rights that we're all born with. He called them God-given rights. There's natural rights that we're all born with that no leader had the right to deny us. Okay, so it doesn't matter how or where you're born. No leader can take away, even you know, even if, no matter how powerful, how strong, or if they thinking they're doing it for your own good, had the power to take from you without your consent. And those natural rights, according to John Locke, are life, liberty, and property. Life, liberty, and property. He argued that government should protect life, liberty, and property. That's its role. If you can protect people's life, liberty, and property, well, you're protecting people. And that should be the extent of what government should do. He also argued that, unlike Hobbes, that you had the right to replace the government if it failed to properly protect your life, liberty, and property. If it went too far, if it infringed on your freedoms, if it infringed on your property. So Locke argued that you had the right to replace the government through revolution or through democratic process, such as elections. Uh, and the Declaration of Independence, as I mentioned just a little bit earlier, is just uh, all through the Declaration of Independence are John Locke's ideas on government. All through the Declaration of Independence, his philosophies on the role of government. Of course, the Declaration is written by Thomas Jefferson, but he uses Locke's ideas, which were the common ideas of the time, of the late 1600s, 1700s, and even up into the 1800s. But John Locke, as I said, the most important philosopher in American history. Now that we've talked about the oldest purpose of all governments, let's take a look at some of the specific purposes listed in the preamble to the U.S. Constitution. These things these items are listed and by the founders because they felt that they were very important for the role as part of the role of the U.S. new U.S. government. So the purposes stated in the U.S. Constitution include establish justice. That basically just means ensure that our governmental and judicial systems are fair to everybody. Of course, we all know that that is not necessarily the case. That our political system, our economic system, and our judicial system, they have their biases and they have their problems. But the one thing that we must always remember is that it's continuing. Historically, we've continued to become uh, a more just society, a fairer society. We've evolved over time and become much more, uh, gotten much more closer to the principle of establishing justice. Uh, as we brought more people into the fold of the political system. The next thing is ensure domestic tranquility. This is another stated purpose of our U.S. government in the Constitution. Domestic, of course, meaning home, tranquility meaning peace. So ensure domestic tranquility. One of the purposes of the government is to ensure we are safe and secure. Here, uh, in our homes and in our communities, in our state and in our nation. Also, that kind of implies, going back to Hobbes, that that's protecting citizens from each other, ensuring domestic tranquility. Next, provide for the common defense. That is basically means one of the purposes of our U.S. government, according to the Constitution, is to protect us from outside invaders or outside threats. Common defense meaning we protect ourselves. So that is, that's what our military is for: our Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard. Uh, those first three that we just talked about, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, those aren't very controversial at all, and they're pretty straightforward. The definition, there's really no ambiguity or any question about what those things mean. This fourth one, though, has always been controversial because it can be interpreted to mean a lot of different things, and that is to one of the purposes of the government is to promote the general welfare. Now, what does that mean? Uh, General, of course, means everybody, the society as a whole. Welfare means well-being. Uh, so, what is the best way to promote the well-being of everybody? And basically, this question is the basis for all policy and policy arguments: conservative, liberal, libertarian, whatever. Uh, each ideology and each politician and each individual believes that I would hope believes that whatever they're promoting, whatever they are trying to do in government, is what's best for everybody. Of course, that doesn't mean we obviously aren't going to agree with each other on what the best way to promote the general welfare is. People that are more liberal believe that the government proactively trying to solve problems, regulating businesses to protect citizens, minimum wages, things like that. That promotes the general welfare. Others would argue that laissez-faire business, hands-off, deregulation of business, that is a better way to promote the general welfare. And basically, everything in between is where policy arguments are made. So I guess maybe a good thing to do is to think to yourself, in your own mind, what is the best way to promote the general welfare? And I bet if you asked a friend of yours what theirs was, you two would probably disagree. Uh, and then finally, secure the blessings of liberty. Basically, that's just a generalized statement saying that our government needs to protect those things that provide freedom. Uh, the government should not infringe on your freedoms. And of course, later, this was in the original preamble to the U.S. Constitution. Later, the Bill of Rights was added, and that was an even more clear attempt to secure the blessings of liberty, to ensure that we had freedom and protections from the powers of government. Now, when it comes down to the basics of it, all governments have to make decisions that affect the people who they govern. And generally, at least the way I look at it, it comes down to a dilemma, meaning a question over what should take priority. And there are three things that you have to consider when making rules regarding a society. And those things are order, freedom, or equality. And all governments have to weigh these three things when deciding uh, how to rule and what laws to make. Which should take priority? Which is more important? Order, is that most important? Is freedom most important? Or is equality most important? Uh, Now, Order is just control, security, and stability. It's knowing and being comfortable and being stable with what will happen. You what you expect is what happens. There's nothing radical. There's nothing unexpected that happens when you have pure order. Freedom can mean a lot of things. It can mean freedom from, like freedom from tyranny, freedom from hunger, freedom from persecution. And of course, it can mean freedom to, such as freedom to speak freely, freedom to practice your own religion, freedom to carry a gun, freedom to wear what clothes you want to, marry who you want to, whatever. Uh, and then there's equality. There's political and social equality. Political equality is basically just that, the right to vote, uh, uh, what your status is politically. Do you have as much political influence as the next person? That's political equality. Social equality is a little more controversial. It's the idea that we should all be, no matter our who we are, we should all be equal, regardless of pure social equality, regardless of status or anything. But basically, over time, social equality has come to, in America at least, to mean this idea of uh, we're all equal regardless of race or religion. Um, now, there's also equality of opportunity, which argues that everybody in America should have the same opportunity to take advantage of their own motivations, their own skills, their own ingenuity to make the most of their lives. That you shouldn't have arbitrary blockades to your success because of you're poor or you're a certain religion or you're a certain race. So that everybody has an equal opportunity to get ahead. That's the idea of equal opportunity. More controversial is equality of outcomes, meaning that uh, you may not be as good at something as somebody else, or you may not be as creative or as motivated as somebody else, yet you still have equal economic or social status. Um, and that's a little more controversial. And we'll talk more about that, especially when we talk about our chapters on civil liberties and civil rights and things like that. Let's talk about order versus freedom. First of all, in its simplest form, order equals government power, the ability to control human behavior. That creates order. Freedom is citizen power, the ability of citizens, individuals, to do whatever they want to in a society. And the two conflict with each other because any new law that creates more order takes away freedom. Um, if there's a new law that says, well, we need to lower the speed limit in this area because there's been a few wrecks, well, that takes away my freedom to drive as fast as I want. And if you think about just about any law that is made, it it creates more order, but takes away freedom. Tax laws, the federal income tax, when the government says, okay, we're going to tax you this much money, they're taking away, that's order because that tells us what to do and it creates money for the government, but also it takes away my freedom to spend my money the way I want to. But of course, in a society, you have to pay taxes because you have to fund the government. But the question becomes, how much of my money are you going to take? Which means how much of my freedom to spend my own money are you going to take? And what are you going to use it for? So, order versus freedom is basically balancing the need for control and stability, which we all want. I think we've recognized that. We all like stability and we all like control. But we also have a human desire for freedom and choice of action. And these two things conflict. We all love freedom of speech, but we oftentimes hear people say things either face to face or on television or in the media that we disagree with. Maybe we find it offensive. We don't like how people dress. We don't like some religions that other people practice, or those that maybe don't practice any religion, and we find these things offensive. But we, if we are going to be a society of free people, we have to accept their freedom to act and say and pray like they want to, because that protects our freedom to act and speak and to pray like we want to. So you can't have freedom just for yourself. If you had to have freedom for you personally to practice your religion, but nobody else can be free to practice their religion, that's not freedom of religion. In generally, especially in nations like in the Middle East, some of the theocratic, more radical nations, you're only allowed to practice one religion. And that's not freedom of religion. Just because it's the majority religion, that's not freedom of religion. That's absolute order. You're told what religion to practice. You are told that you can only these churches can exist, or you don't have the freedom. So what freedoms to do things naturally brings conflict into it, because there's always going to be people out there who do things that we disagree with. But we have to accept their right to freedom to do what they want to do, say what they want to say, in order to protect our own freedoms. Uh, but which should take priority? It's a question for each individual citizen, and that once again that plays out in politics. Uh, how much freedom is too much? How much order is too much? Many people post 9/11 terrorist attacks argue that the order, the kind of quote unquote police state that's been established, where the government has been secretly searching emails and listening in on phone conversations. Some people argue that is taking order too far, because it's taking away our freedom to communicate with people, you know, without being, eavesdropped on. So there's a lot of different ways you can look at this idea of order versus freedom. Now, also, you got freedom versus equality. Uh, Ensuring equality may limit the freedoms of some people. Uh, and as I mentioned before, there are two types of equality: political equality, which were established with things like the 13th Amendment, which uh, outlawed slavery, that provided citizenship to former slaves, that created more political equality. The 15th Amendment, which theoretically provided the right to vote for male, uh, all male citizens, regardless of race, previous condition of servitude, all those things. And then the 19th Amendment, which guaranteed women the right to vote. All these things create political equality. And while at the time they were somewhat controversial, today that they're not controversial at all. But social equality is something else. Social equality is basically saying that we need to make laws to ensure that people are treated the same way. Not the fact that they have the same access to the political system, but they are treated the same way. The 14th Amendment basically states that states may not deny people equal protection of the laws or due process of the laws. And this stems from the post-Civil War attempts by southern states to basically disenfranchise and create a segregated, uh, separate societies for the newly freed slaves. Racial segregation, separate sets of laws called Jim Crow laws that were put in place to limit the ability of African Americans to what kind of land they could own, what kind of jobs they could have, where they could live, and it created a separate set of laws for them, so they weren't being treated equally in society. And the 14th Amendment says you must treat all citizens equally. The law must apply to everybody equally, and not uh, discriminate, if you will, or set aside certain categories uh, of laws for just certain people. Brown versus Board of Education, Supreme Court decision, of course, which desegregated schools, public schools, because prior to that Supreme Court decision, southern states especially had separate schools for black children and white children. And the Supreme Court ruled that that's inherently unequal. That you can't have a system like that, because that violates the, the, the principle of equality. Although it is the government coming in and forcing local communities and states to end a practice that they themselves in the states and the local communities have long held is acceptable for their traditions and for their society. And then finally, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which made it illegal to um, basically discriminate against people based on race, religion, gender, with regard to public accommodations. If you own a business, you can't, say I'm not going to serve Jewish people, or I'm not going to serve black people, or I'm not going to serve women. If you serve the public, then uh, you're required to treat people, equally. You cannot discriminate in hiring people. If uh, the most qualified person should be hired regardless of race, gender, religion. And so these types of laws, these social equality laws, were put into place to create a more fair and equal society. Now let's talk about the different types of government. And different types of governments, according to the philosopher Aristotle, he categorized one of the things that Aristotle did throughout his career and what made him famous was categorizing things, placing things in different categories to show differences and similarities. So he broke governments down into these different types of categories. First, a monarchy. A monarchy consists of a single ruler who rules in the public interest, meaning that in general they're looking out for the needs of he's looking at a king would look out for the needs of his subjects, and that would be the priority. Does that mean now that doesn't mean that he doesn't take care of himself and enrich himself, but his priority is the needs of his subjects. A totalitarian regime or a totalitarian rule would be a single ruler who rules in self-interest. It's what we generally think of as a dictator, somebody who just makes arbitrary laws that benefit him or herself. Also, we have an aristocracy, which is a group of people who rule, an elite few who rule in the public interest. They're aristocratic, and they are also, wealthy, and they're generally the landowners and the most politically important people in the society. Uh, but they rule in the interest of the masses, because generally for them, when the masses are happy and placated, their position is more secure. An oligarchy, on the other hand, you have the elite few who rule in self-interest. They're there to enrich themselves, and they really don't care, uh, for the most part, about the situation of the masses, if you will. Uh, so now these aristocracies and these oligarchies, they when I say of an elite few, that could be, depending on the size of the society, could be anywhere from a few hundred to a few thousand people or families. Uh, and then polity. Polity, according to Aristotle, is where many rule. The masses rule in the public interest. So when people go to vote, and generally it's a democratic type system, when people go to vote, they vote based on what is best for society, what is best for their neighbor, what is best for everybody. So it's a kind of a it's a system where people are involved, a polity system where people are involved in the process, but uh, they make their decisions based on what's in the best interest of the public. A democracy, which of course is what the United States hangs its hat on and claims to be, is the rule of many in self-interest. For the most part, while there are exceptions to this rule, most people who vote in our democracy and in most other democracies vote for their self-interest. They vote for people or policies or support people and policies that will, in the long run or the short run, benefit themselves. And then finally, anarchism. Anarchism or anarchy is no government. And if we can refer back to Thomas Hobbes, we remember that the way he explained it, and I tend to agree with him, that a world with no government is not a place we would want to be. It is a state of nature where there is no control. So anarchism is no government. Now let's take a closer look at this concept of democracy. Of course, democracy being the type of government that the United States claims to have. Democracy. There's two types of democracy: direct democracy and indirect democracy. Direct democracy is a system of government in which members of the polity meet to discuss all policy decisions and then agree to abide by majority rule. Okay. So basically, all people who are qualified, and that can mean uh, many different things in different societies. So whoever is qualified to make decisions uh, in the society or qualified to participate in politics in the society, those people will meet at intervals, once a month or every 2 months or quarterly or whatever. They will meet and discuss all policy problems, all things that are on the agenda, and then agree to abide by majority rule after everybody votes. The earliest governments in American history, the colonial governments, especially Jamestown for early on, and the New England town hall, the New England governments, uh, they were direct democracies. All of the basically the white male property owners of the society, which those are the only ones that were allowed to participate in the political system. So all the white male property owners would come together occasionally and just discuss all of the issues of the day, and then they would all vote, and the majority rule would would determine the policy. So direct democracy. But as the societies grew and more people entered the society, and they became extended, and they people started living farther away from each other, that became really unworkable, where everybody had to drive long, or not drive, but ride their horses long distance to participate in this in the town hall meetings or whatever. So that became unworkable as the population grew, and the communities became to develop farther apart. And so we evolved into a system of indirect democracy or representative democracy, and it's the kind of system we have now, and it's the system that is uh, called for in our U.S. Constitution. It's a system of government that gives citizens the opportunity to vote for representatives who will make decisions on their behalf. So we as citizens don't vote on every issue. We as citizens don't determine policy. What we do is we elect people to make those decisions for us. So to as far as decisions made that regarding our local community, our city, well, we elect members of the city council and the mayor, and they make those decisions on our behalf. They represent us. The county commissioners court makes decisions regarding county business on our behalf. We elect them, and they make those decisions. And of course, state representatives that we elect, they make decisions regarding state law. And then of course, nationally, we elect members of the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate to make national law. So they represent us. We are not actively making policy as citizens. We elect people to do that for us, and we can hold them accountable, and that's the whole purpose of elections. We use elections to hold them accountable. If they begin making policy that does not reflect in general the needs and the wants of the people they represent, then we can elect somebody else. But indirect democracy is the type of democracy we have today, also called representative democracy. It's just a small chart showing the different categories by Aristotle, kind of in a more kind of in a graph form. Uh, Rule by one in the public interest is a monarchy; in the self-interest, it's tyranny. Rule by the few in the public interest, it's aristocracy; in the self-interest, it's oligarchy; and the rule by the many, uh, if it's a in the public interest, polity; self-interest, democracy. Now let's take a look at the roots of American government, because it's obvious that the founders of our nation, the authors of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they didn't just wake up one morning with this incredible new idea of self-rule, democracy in their heads. There were roots that go way back in our history that lead us to the kinds of governments and the kind of political philosophies that we adhere to now in the United States. And the roots of American government really begin with two events. One, the Reformation, and the other, the Enlightenment. The Reformation was a religious movement, and the Enlightenment was an intellectual and philosophical movement. And they both were important in the formation of the ideas that lead to our U.S. Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, and the types of government that we have today. They're very important, both the Reformation and the Enlightenment, because they both rejected something called the divine right of kings. The divine right of kings. And here's what the divine right of kings is. It's a circular argument that allows kings to persuade their subjects to accept their rule. Every leader, whether they be a dictator, a king, a president, whatever, they crave legitimacy. And legitimacy just means that they want their subjects to accept them as their leader. If you're a legitimate leader, that means you are accepted and you have a right to be there. And you want the public to and your subjects to accept your leadership. Well, the idea of the divine right of kings basically says this. The king, of course, this idea of divine right of kings comes out of the Middle Ages, and in the Middle Ages, the 1400s, 1300s, 1400s, those centuries, where the church was really the most important institution in Western Europe and in the European theater, if you will. So the church was very important. Most people were illiterate. Only religious leaders were literate. The Pope, cardinals, priests, and so they were the only ones that could read the Bible, and so they interpreted the Bible for the masses, and they told the masses what the Bible meant. And therefore the masses were beholden to their knowledge, the knowledge of the elite, the knowledge of the those that could read. So the kings knew that, and the kings knew that these religious subjects were generally superstitious and and uh, and were and very religious. So they would argue this. They would say, look, as you know, and what the priests tell you, and what the Pope tells you, is that God exists, God is infallible, and God controls everything. And then they would say, if I am king, now if I am king and God controls everything and God is infallible, then God must want me to be king. And by definition, kings rule over their subjects, and the subjects must follow the rules of the king. Therefore, if you, as my subject, defy me and do not follow what I say, aren't you actually defying God? Aren't you actually rejecting the rule of God and the Word of God? Therefore, if you don't accept me as your legitimate ruler and do what I say, you're rejecting God, and you will basically go to hell. And this was the divine right of kings. This was the argument that kings made. Okay. Now, both the Reformation, as I said, which was a religious movement, and the Enlightenment, which was an intellectual and philosophical movement, both rejected this idea. They both said, no, 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 no. This is not how leaders should legitimize their rule. Now, the Reformation was a religious movement, and it began with the Protestant split from the Church of England. And one of the things the Protestants argued, and this it leads to the rejection of the divine right of kings, is that people could have a personal relationship with God. You did not need the church to tell you what your relationship with God was, what it took to be saved, or they didn't need, according to the Reformation, you didn't need an intermediary such as a priest or a cardinal or a bishop or a pope. Okay, of course, if you say these types of things in the 15, 16, 1700s, you are going to be persecuted by the establishment uh, of the Church of England and other and the Catholic Church. So the Puritans flee. They run around the world a little bit and end up on the shores of the New World. Uh, and when the Puritans land at Plymouth, they basically the first thing they do is, of course, establish their churches. And these churches they establish with something called self-governing congregations. Self-governing congregations. This basically they're saying instead of the top-down hierarchy where the Pope, the bishops, the cardinals determine who the leadership will be in each individual Catholic church, the Puritans, Protestants, the congregation themselves choose their leaders, choose their own rules, determine things for themselves. And so they're self-governing, much like a self-governing government where people vote for their leaders and vote for the policies that they want to implement. The church did this as well. And while it was specifically isolated to the church, these self-governing congregations, they it planted the seeds for the later concepts and the future concepts of governmental self-rule, governmental self-determination. Uh, so the Reformation. Now the Enlightenment was an intellectual and philosophical movement, which I spoke of, and the Enlightenment. These were just really smart, literate people who looked at the world and said, you know what? We don't need the priest or the church telling us how the world works or 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 or, um, or why things happen. We can figure it out for ourselves through human reason, through logic, through thinking, and so the Enlightenment thinkers basically believed in human reason. They believed in science, the scientific method, and well, I'm gonna have to stop. So the fundamental ideas that are at the root of American government, of course, come from the Enlightenment and the Reformation. But there are some other ideas that are also important to our American government and and the formation of it. First, Hobbes and Locke. Hobbes and Locke, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, both agreed. Although they had different reasons to kind of agree with this, they both agreed that government is necessary. Okay, that it makes our life better, it protects us from each other, and it just creates a more peaceful and uh, pleasant world to live in if you have government to kind of control people's behaviors and to set rules, societal rules by which we live. Another philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, came up with this idea called social contract theory. And basically, his idea is that people come together in a society for the purpose of creating a better world. Uh, but, he said, there are problems with government. And of course, Hobbes touches on this, and Locke especially touches on this as well. But there are problems with government. Governments inherently repress those natural born rights that Locke talked about, life, liberty, and property. So, because governments, especially monarchies or totalitarian governments, they can repress those natural born rights. The only legitimate authority, the only legitimate leaders come from the consent of those who are being governed. So, the only way a leader can be legitimate is if those people who he or she rules over consents to be governed, meaning they agree to be governed. I will let you make rules to govern me, is basically what the people would say if there is legitimate authority. And in return, of course, it's a contract. So in return, once we give them that power, we say, okay, you can make rules. We will follow those rules as long as they don't infringe on those natural born rights. Also, according to Rousseau, the people are sovereign. Okay, according to social contract theory, the people are sovereign, meaning in the end, they have the final say as to all matters. Okay, the people are sovereign. They're the only ones that can determine for themselves what types of government they have, who will be part of that government, and if the governments that they've chosen do not work for them or violate their natural rights, they're sovereign, so they have the power to change them. Uh, the sovereign government should consider society to have certain public concerns and the common good. So, sovereign government should consider society to have certain public concerns. So there are certain things that society must be able to do, meaning the group of people that that are necessary to have a productive, safe society. But they also there are common goods that tie in with this, where you know there are things that maybe infringe on individual rights, but because they're for the common good, they would override some individual rights, though there are not many of those. But, and here's maybe the real crux of what Rousseau is getting at, especially with regard to American political thought, is that people maintain their freedoms unless they conflict with the common good. This is a fundamental thing we talk about, and it's a fundamental issue that we deal with, every day in government. You know, people maintain their freedoms. You can do whatever you want to until you cross the line and it
I don't know.
threatens or
Thinking maybe
conflicts or
she really likes the
or
blue duck. She likes her
um,
hamburgers.
challenges what is
It's good.
best for
It's very
the
good. The price
society
it's
as a
kind of a
whole.
little bit pricey, but
And you
I've
can
never
talk
had a
about
bad thing.
many,
We've eaten
many,
a
many
lot of stuff
different
there.
policies
It's
or
good.
many,
So if you want to
many
have like
different
go out with a
actions
nice
of
meal, you
individuals.
or something.
Some people may claim it
Yeah,
doesn't
it's a nice
infringe
place
with the
to go.
common good.
It's
Others
they have really
claim
good food.
maybe
It's
it
really
does.
nice inside
And
too.
that goes back to ideology and whether, the role of government and the role of the person. It goes back to your own religious beliefs. Uh, you know, uh, People think that some people would argue that, like something, a current event type issue like gay marriage, that while that's personal freedom, it might conflict with the common good. uh, Others would argue that, uh, pure free enterprise is pure freedom, but others would argue that that conflicts with the common good because it's a selfish enterprise or whatever. So there's many different things that could be considered personal freedoms that some could argue conflict with the common good. And that's the purpose of our government and the purpose of debate and the purpose of the legislatures is to kind of come to a compromise and come to a reasoned reckoning of what freedoms don't conflict with the common good and what freedoms do, and therefore which of our freedoms through laws, because we know all laws limit freedoms, which laws are legitimate and which are not. So with all these philosophical ideas floating around, we had people show up at the shores of the New World, the Americas, and create their colonies, their communities, and most all of them had local participation. There was some form of democratic participation in all of the newly established settlements. Okay. But then, of course, those grew into larger, more organized,
Can't believe it's almost
oftentimes
Thanksgiving.
um, colony-wide type governmental units and representative
Yep.
units. So early on, you had the Virginia House of Burgesses, established in 1619. It was the first representative colonial legislature in American history, or at least in the New World. So the Virginia House of Burgesses, established in 1619, was the first representative colonial government. Of course, New England also had their town hall meetings, which were basically representative councils that took care of the issues of the day for localities, not colony wide. Like there wasn't a town hall for Massachusetts as a whole, but there would maybe a town hall for Plymouth or later Boston or whatever. Uh, and the thing we have to remember here too, is in our relationship, all of these people who came over in Virginia and in New England, they were British subjects. They were part of England. They were English citizens and were loyal to the British Crown, loyal to the King. So, uh, but as they began to establish themselves over here in the colonial, uh, during the colonial period in the colonies, there was very little royal interference. Okay, they kind of let them do what they want over in the colonies. All they asked is that they paid, tariffs, taxes on trade, and that was really the only uh, revenue that was required by England. One thing that England did not do, and this was very, very important to understanding why there was a revolution later against England, is that England did not directly tax the colonists, meaning they did not tax the colonists on their property that they owned in the colonies. England did not tax purchases at the local general store in the colonies. Uh, Now, that doesn't mean that the colonists did not pay taxes, but they were not taxed by Great Britain or by England or by the Parliament or by the King. They taxed themselves because they knew, and all governments know, you have to have money and resources to run the government. So what would happen is these local councils, these town hall meetings, these legislative councils that were established by the communities would tax themselves. They would say, okay, at the town hall meeting, they would be about, okay, we're going to tax, a 1% tax on all tea bought in the local stores. And so that's how they would raise money. But what wasn't happening is England was not directly taxing them. Uh, England made their money through an economic system, basically called mercantilism. And and the idea of mercantilism is that a nation or an empire, but a nation really, increased its national wealth by promoting domestic industry through favorable trade balance. Here's the way it works. Back then, back in the 1600s, 1500s, 1600s, the common knowledge at the time was that there was only a finite amount of wealth in the world. There was only so much gold, so much silver, uh, so much money. And therefore, if you as a nation wanted to be richer, then you had to sell more goods from other countries than you bought. Just like you as a person, if you want to become richer and increase your wealth, you save more than you buy. You make more money than you spend. Okay? Same thing here. You want to have a favorable trade balance as a nation, meaning you want to sell more goods that you make domestically in your country to other countries, therefore getting their wealth into your country. You want to sell more than you buy from other countries, because when you buy something from other countries, you're giving them money for a finished product. So mercantilism is basically this idea that the only way a nation can become wealthier is if they sell more than they buy. Therefore, it's imperative in this system that you produce things in your country to sell, that you produce finished goods. You have domestic industry that makes things. Of course, the problem is that to make things, you usually need raw materials, and raw materials are always not always plentiful in your country. So sometimes you have to go elsewhere to get the raw materials. And of course, if you buy raw materials from another country, you're sending money out, and it violates the principles of mercantilism. So what Great Britain and other nations did in order to make sure they had access to raw materials for their domestic industry, while also protecting their wealth, they would basically colonize the places around the world that had the raw materials they wanted. So if you're a shipbuilding nation like Great Britain was, or England was, and you needed quality lumber to build those ships, the New World had quality lumber. Okay. If another nation controlled the New World, then you would have to pay for that quality lumber. You'd have to give them your money to have the raw materials to build your ships. And that's money going out. And you don't want that. So you colonize the New World, and you have access to that, to those raw materials. Now you're still paying for it. You're still paying your colonists for the raw materials. But what England did to ensure that the money stayed within their empire, they passed something called the Navigation Acts. And basically it restricted trade of the colonists to where they could only uh, buy most finished goods from England. Because if colonists bought finished goods, products that they wanted from France or Portugal or some other nation, that's money going out of the empire, and you don't want to do that. So the Navigation Acts basically uh, were trade restrictions on colonies to promote mercantilism, to promote growth in national wealth, and it basically prevented the colonists or told the colonists not to buy things from other countries, only buy from England whenever possible. The only problem is the colonies are the Atlantic Ocean away from England, very difficult to enforce with all the ports and coastlines of the New World, of the east coast of what is now the United States. And so it was difficult to enforce, and also it was resented by the colonists because the colonists may get better deals from other countries. They may get better quality products from other countries, and they didn't like the idea that England was telling them what they could buy and where they could buy it. So they were ignored, and and it was called statutory neglect. England knew that it was being ignored, but they really didn't have the resources to do anything about it. They just kind of just sloughed it off. So this was a situation early on in American colonial history. You had the colonies growing very quickly. They had established representative governments, and the British government, the Parliament and the King, kind of ignored them, let them kind of develop on their own, let them create their own type of institutions, their own norms of society, their own economic norms. And one of those economic norms that they created was this idea of they only tax themselves, that Great Britain did not directly tax them. Um, and then something fundamentally changed everything in the middle of the 1700s. Now, by the middle of the 1700s, the colonies had existed for almost 150 years. Okay, they had been there a long time, and they had been left alone for 150 years. And so, but what was happening is they were running out of land, really, to to settle in the area along the eastern seaboard of the United States that we now think of as, Virginia, New York, Maine, South Carolina, whatever. Um, so they're running out of space. So they began moving westward over the boundary that we will call the um, Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachian Mountains, and I'll show you a map of the Appalachian Mountains here in just a moment. But they started crossing over, and it was in this area where uh, the Indians had been displaced to. Of course, the Indians had controlled all the land along the eastern seaboard of the colonies until the colonists showed up, and as they continued to migrate, immigration continued from England and from Europe. It forcibly pushed the Indians deeper into the woods until finally they were pressed up against the Appalachian Mountains, which run kind of parallel to the eastern seaboard, and then finally they were pushed over to the other side. And during this time, the colonists would always say, "You just move a little bit farther westward, and we'll leave you alone." And the Indians would be like, "Well, we don't want to, but we really have no choice because we can't really resist the onslaught and the flood of immigrants coming in." So finally, they moved over to across the Appalachian Mountains, further into the heart of what is now the United States, and they developed a very very good relationship with French traders there. You had French traders who were protected by some, French military outposts, and there was a very good relationship because the Indians had a much better relationship with the French because the French weren't there to establish permanent colonies that were going to inevitably grow to cities. They were just there to trade. Okay, they were just there to trade, and the French military posts that were set up were simply there to protect the traders. Uh, but as land became scarce along for British settlers, they began to move into this territory that was being occupied by the French and the Indians. And so a war began over this. Of course, there was a broader war in Europe. The French and the British were always fighting wars in Europe, and this was just kind of a spillover. And so the French and Indian War began, also called the Seven Years' War for testing purposes, either the French and Indian War or the Seven Years' War. And it lasted between 1756 and 1763. Um, so the war was fought, and the colonists, alongside the British military, the Redcoats, finally defeated the French and the Indians. And this is where everything kind of fundamentally changes, because the British, once the war was over, they kind of took a long, hard look at their relationship with the colonies. And they decided that it wasn't working out the way they had thought. So they changed their policies toward the colonies. The British, once the war was over, changed their policies towards the colonies. They basically said, you guys started this war. You're the ones that moved it over into the French and Indian territory, where they were peaceably living, and you started this war. So you are going uh, to pay for the war. Also, because you kept going over there, and that was the reason, we're going to now limit your ability to do that. You are going to need explicit permission. Now they're telling, this is the Parliament and the King telling this to the colonists. You're going to need explicit permission to settle territory on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. That was the Proclamation of 1763. The Proclamation of 1763 basically stated that there will be no more settlement in what's called the Ohio Valley, um, or Northwest Territory, or whatever you want to call it, uh, without explicit permission from Parliament. Okay. Also, they said these wars are expensive. Just like today, wars are expensive. Back then, wars are expensive. So, because the war was your fault, colonists, the British said, we're going to have you pay for the war. And the way we're going to have you pay for the war is to directly tax you. Remember that one thing that the colonists never had to do was pay direct taxes to Great Britain? Well, now they're going to have to. So they're going. The British are going to begin directly taxing the colonists for the cost of the war and for the administration of the colonies. Okay, paying for the government. So they implemented a couple of taxes: the sugar tax, stamp tax, and Quartering Act of 1765. Quartering Act's not really a tax; it was just a policy that said that the colonists must provide housing for British soldiers who are over in the colonies. Now, the stamp tax was an important one because it was a tax on all official documents used in the colonies, and so this directly impacted the business leaders, those that had that were most influential and most capable of fomenting resistance to these new policies. And so, with these new taxes and with the Quartering Act, protests began in the colonies, especially right around the Boston area in New England. That was kind of the hotbed for protests. But protests began. People began questioning British policy and questioning the British's right to tax them in this way. Okay, this map shows the proclamation line of 1763. That purple line is basically the ridge of the Appalachian Mountains, and that it was that mountain range that was being crossed over continuously, or at least it's not exactly the mountain range, but it kind of runs roughly along it. But that was going to be the new border where the colonists could no longer cross over without British consent. Uh, and of course, you can see that many of these areas have already, the dark green area, the settlements had already butted up against the mountains, and it was in these areas, like in Maryland and in Virginia, that they began spilling over into this French and Indian territory until the war. Of course, once the war was won, in 1763, that became British territory. So as we said, there began to be protests, and and for the first time, really, these colonies, they were very different when they were first established. They had different uh, religious norms. Their societies were different, especially the differences between the New England societies and the southern colonies. The New England colonies were more nuclear family, smaller farms. Uh, by nuclear family, I mean like a mother, father, and children, and very religious in New England. The southern colonies less religious, fewer nuclear families. The economy was a plantation slave economy. In New England, it was more, there were slaves in New England, but there just weren't as many, and you didn't have the agricultural economic necessity to have slaves in New England. But anyway, so they're very different. But and they didn't have a whole lot in common, but they did have in common one thing, and this: they didn't like these new taxes. So all these disparate colonies, not all of them, but 9 of the 13, came together in 1765 for something that would be called the Stamp Act Congress. They met in New York City, and basically they said, okay, what what is it that we don't like about what Great Britain's doing to us? And so there was all these grievances. Mainly, it was about the taxation problem, about being directly taxed. And so they sent a list of grievances to Parliament and to the King in England. And basically, the gist of it was, and this is that famous thing you learned in middle school, hopefully, that little reminder of what their complaint was, is no taxation without representation. And basically, what that means is that they felt like that if they were going to be taxed, if the government of Great Britain was going to be tax them and take their property, their money, that they should have representatives in Parliament in England from the colonies. But there were no colonial representatives in Parliament to argue their side of the case. It was a separate government across the ocean that was taking away their money without their consent. Okay, and if you go back to the philosophies of Locke and Rousseau, you can't do that. That violates their natural born rights to their property. Remember life, liberty, and property? Property is money. And you can only have your property taken, according to Locke and Rousseau, you can only have your property taken by your own consent. And with no representatives of the colonies in Parliament in England, the colonists felt like they were not able to give their consent. So it was taxation without representation. And this became the rallying cry. And so with the rise in protests, more British troops were sent to New England, and the tensions rose. On March 5th, 1770, you had a Boston Massacre, which was the first real bloodshed of the disagreement between the British and the colonies. 1772, the Committee of Correspondence is formed, and basically each colony and each major community in each colony had this committee that would, if anything dealing with the British came about that they felt was important enough to share, uh, they were required to pass that information by horseback or whatever along to the next colony, and the next colony would pass it along to the next colony. And it created a communication system, which would come in really handy once that communication system would be already established once the revolution started. Then the Tea Act of 1773 was passed, which basically was the British trying to bail out a failed tea company. The East India Tea Company was going bankrupt, and it had investors in it in Parliament, and so they were looking for ways to save their investment. So basically, they said, "Okay, colonists, we're going to pass this tea act that says you can only buy tea from this one tea company." And tea was, of course, a very popular drink in the colonies. And while the tea wasn't overpriced, I mean, it was competitively priced, and they weren't being charged more than they should have been for the tea. They were just didn't the colonists didn't like the idea of being forced to buy tea from a specific company by the government. So in retaliation, they dressed up some rebels dressed up as Indians, boarded one of the ships that was carrying the tea, and dumped the tea over into Boston Harbor, later known as the Boston Tea Party. Uh, that was kind of the last straw for Great Britain and for the Parliament. They passed the Coercive Acts of 1774 after the Boston Tea Party, also called by the colonists the Intolerable Acts, and they basically shut down Boston Harbor, blockaded it until all that tea was paid for, and they implemented a new quartering act, which because they were going to be sending new troops to the colonies, so a new quartering act, which basically said that colonists must provide housing for all British troops, even if it means placing British troops in private homes, which that did not go over well. Imagine if you were a colonist and you had a home and you had a wife and two daughters, and all of a sudden Great Britain is telling you that you're going to have, you know, British troops living with you with your wife and children. That and that was very offensive to the colonists. But the point is, though, that everything, the tension is being ratcheted up here. The coercive acts and the protests will become much more intense. Now, as tensions rise after the Boston Massacre and the Stamp Act Congress and all the other tensions between um, the colonists and England rise, uh, the colonists decide that it's probably time to get together, even more so in the way they did with the Stamp Act Congress, and try to resolve these problems. And one thing we have to remember as they get into the Continental Congress, that a large majority of them, most, uh, if you want to use statistics, most of the colonists are still loyal British subjects. They're still uh, want to stay part of the British Empire because there's a lot of benefits to that: security, just protection, also economic privileges with being part of the British Empire. But with all the tensions, with the extra taxes, the blockade of Boston Harbor, um, things are getting to be to a breaking point, towards a breaking point. And so the First Continental Congress is convened in Philadelphia in the fall of 1774. And basically what they've decided to do is issue a Declaration of Rights and Resolves. And basically it's a list of the grievances and asking, you know, the king and parliament to address these grievances. And in a nutshell, basically what they're wanting is everything to revert back to like it was before uh, the French and Indian War, before the 7 Years' War, when basically the colonies were able to do whatever they wanted to, and the British just ignored them. But of course, the British are not going to let that happen at this point. So they send this Declaration of Rights and Resolves, asking, for, you know, explaining their side of the story, and they decided that, you know, of course, we don't have email at this point, and there's no telephone, so it's got to get on a boat and cross the Atlantic and then come back, and so there's going to be a delay. And so they adjourn the Congress and they decide that if the demands are not met, they don't hear back in a positive way, they will meet again in May of 1775. But the month before that, when that meeting was due to happen, you have what we now know of as, and we call the shots heard around the world, where you have the first real uh, confrontation, military confrontation between the colonists and the British. While the Boston Massacre was kind of an accident, this was an organized, planned ambush by the colonists of the British, who were the British redcoats, who were trying to go confiscate ammo and gunpowder from an armory in Lexington and Concord. So with this hanging over their head, this Lexington and Concord, the bloodshed, the Second Continental Congress meets, and they make one last attempt to mend the fences with Great Britain by sending something called the Olive Branch Petition, uh, and they're going to have to wait for a reply from that. But in the meantime, they realize that they're getting close to an irrevocable break with Great Britain, and they realize that if that happens, that there will be war. They form a Continental Army. Well, they don't really form it. They just say, okay, we will start forming a Continental Army, and they choose George Washington to head this Continental Army. He's probably the most respected man, one of the most respected men at the Continental Congress, and he's got military experience, and he's willing to take the job. And it's during this debate, a little later after the appointment of Washington, that Richard Henry Lee, a representative from Virginia, stands up and calls for independence and says, you know, we've come this far. The ties between us and the mother country are irrevocably broken. There's nothing that can fix it. We're on the verge of war. So let's go ahead and declare kind of what we already think we are, and that's independent. And so this thus begins a great debate. Many people think that the early colonists, the colonists, when they were discussing this independence, were everybody jumped on board and said, "Yeah, let's do it." And there was no dissent. There was a lot of dissent. There was a lot of debate because the ramifications of declaring independence and losing were uh, huge. Uh, Basically, if you declare independence, you're declaring war against your country, and that's treason. And the penalty for treason in almost every nation is death. So uh, they're arguing that they're saying declare independence, but they really have no army. They just formed the Continental Army, which really has no soldiers, only a bunch of colonial militias. And so and they're facing the greatest military on earth in the British Empire. So the loss would mean all of their heads. Uh, and so nothing was resolved in the debate, but they did decide to form a committee to work on a possible declaration of independence. If in case that the independence was voted on, then they would have something to tell the people, a document for the people. And that committee to work on the declaration that was consisted of Ben Franklin, John Adams, Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, and most famously Thomas Jefferson, who is considered the author of the Declaration of Independence. And he did write most of it, but he had some input from the others. Finally, on July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress finally adopts the Declaration of Independence after all their attempts to fix things with Great Britain fail. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Locke is maybe the most influential philosopher in in American history because his ideas on natural rights, on the role of government in protecting life, liberty, and property, and on the idea that if the government does not properly work for the people, that you have the right to overthrow it. All of these ideas are in the Declaration of Independence, especially the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, which of course was mostly written by Thomas Jefferson. And so I'm going to read it real quick and we'll go through and we'll try to find these Lockean influences. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Of course, this is maybe the most hypocritical and controversial line in the whole thing because, Jefferson writes all men are created equal. Of course, he's a slave owner. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Remember those natural rights that Locke talked about? That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, Locke said life, liberty, and property, but for whatever reason they switched property to happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, social contract. The people decide. Only the people uh, can agree to be governed. Only the people can consent to have rules made that affect them. And so they are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, meaning that when any form of government stops protecting life, liberty, and happiness, and stops um, considering the consent of the governed, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Of course, that's Locke's idea. Hobbes would say no, but Locke says yes, you can alter or abolish it. And to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So as you can see, he's basically spelling out, the rights of man and their rights in forming their own government and how uh, and the basic underlying principle is that all governments must come from the consent of the governed. Uh, no longer will we accept kings who say, "I am your king you know, because I am." You, the people, have to consent for him to be the king and agree for him to be the king. And so
The Declaration of Independence has been ratified, and now, therefore, the colonies are now states, and they are free and independent, separate from Great Britain. But there's a problem. Now they have to form their own national government. They and basically the government they know they have to form a government simply for the fact that they're going to fight a war. And you must have centralized authority in war. You can't have 13 different states fighting 13 different wars without some kind of overarching central authority. So they formed their first national government, and it's the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation is the first American government. For testing purposes, it's the first American government. And they themselves called it a loose league of friendship. And it's a confederation form of government, which we'll talk a little bit more about when we talk about federalism. But basically, in a confederation form of government, the states have all the power. The states or regional governments are sovereign, meaning there's no other authority higher than them. And in a confederation form of government, these sovereign states form the national government. They create the national government and give the national government any power that they want it to have. And because they formed the national government and the states gave the national government the power that it has, they can strip that power. They can alter the national government whenever and if ever they want to. So all the power in a confederation form of government lies with the states. Now, the main points of the Articles of Confederation are this: there will be a single legislative body that basically has very little power and is only allowed basically wartime powers, because that's why they formed the government in the first place, is to fight the Revolutionary War. Uh, each state retains its sovereignty and independence with absolute authority within its territories, meaning that the national government cannot tell the states anything, that they make them do anything they don't want to do. One vote per state in the Congress, regardless of state size. This will be a sticking point because Virginia will resent the fact that Rhode Island has equal status in the Articles of Confederation Congress, even though Rhode Island is much smaller, has a much smaller economy, and many fewer people. If you want to pass any law in the Articles of Confederation Congress, it takes 9 of 13 states. And that's so difficult because, as we mentioned earlier, the states are just, at this point, those states, the southern states, are so different and have different interests than the New England states. It's going to be very hard for them to agree on anything. And if you want to amend the articles, meaning actually change the Articles of Confederation, it takes the unanimous vote of all the states. And if you can't pass a law of 9 of 13, there's no way you're going to get a unanimous vote for anything. And selection and payment of delegates is by the respective states, meaning if the states lose interest in the Confederation and they lose interest in the Congress, then they'll quit paying their representatives and their representatives will quit going. While the Articles of Confederation worked relatively well during the Revolutionary War, it served its purpose. It kept the states kind of focused on the goal. Once the war was over, uh, the national government floundered. The states really didn't see it as necessary anymore. Remember, initially it was just a loose league of friendship for the purpose of fighting the war. Now that the war is over and they're independent, the states are kind of all going their own way, and it creates major problems. And historians have later called this the critical period. The period of 1781, which is basically the end of the Revolutionary War, through 1789, which is the establishment of the U.S. Constitution. Here are the problems that existed. First, lack of national sentiment. Lack of national sentiment. People were loyal to their states and not to the national government. People like Jefferson always said, "I would love to go. I can't wait to go back to my country, Virginia." Uh, and so, that was very common, where people identified more with their states and were more loyal to their states than to their than to the nation. The Articles of Confederation Congress had no power to tax. Um, they could ask for money, but they couldn't force states or anybody to pay the money. So it was all voluntary from the states. And that might not be such a problem, except that the national government during the Revolutionary War borrowed money from other nations to fight the war. And without the ability to tax, they did not have the ability to pay back their debt. And as a new country on the scene, on the world stage, you know, that's not a good way to start off by not paying back your debts. They had no power to regulate commerce, meaning no power to regulate trade between the states. So if there were any trade disputes between, say, Pennsylvania and New York, there was nobody to settle it. There was nobody to be an arbiter. So it could often possibly end up in, as most territorial disputes could end up in war. And there was no power of Congress, of the legislature, of the Articles of Confederation to regulate that. There was no executive or judicial branch, meaning the Articles of Confederation Congress could make a law, but there was no executive branch to carry out the law or enforce the law. There's no judicial branch to place people on trial if they broke the law. So it was a very weak government, and there was just a general lack of a strong central governing authority. The central government, the Articles of Confederation, national government, basically had no power to do anything. And everybody kind of knew it, but nobody really wanted to do anything about it until one event happened. And that one event was called Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion kind of lit a fire under the elites, especially the elites of the states. And here's basically what happened with Shays' Rebellion. The state of Massachusetts had its own debt from the Revolution. They borrowed money themselves as well to fund the war for their state, to pay their militia. And they created debt. And so Massachusetts passes a new constitution that basically places the burden, the taxation burden, on farmers. And those are the poorest people. They're poor and middle class. They're the farmers. Of course, the elites are making the Constitution, and they're the very wealthy, and they're the ones living in Boston and in the city, and they're not. The Constitution benefits them and really punishes the farmers. Well, this angers the farmers. Also, they began foreclosing on farms of Revolutionary War veterans. Now, you got to remember, most everybody's a farmer back then. And when people came calling, when the American government came calling, or the states came calling, asking people to fight in the Revolutionary War, well, that means those men would have to leave their farms. And while, the wives and the children and possibly slaves here and there would be able to run the farm, that's still one less hand to work when the patriarch has gone to fight a war. And also, usually the patriarch, handles the financial business during that time. So basically, there was an understood agreement between the governments and these Revolutionary War veterans that when they asked them to go fight in the Revolutionary War, they wouldn't punish them if they got behind on their payments. But Massachusetts began to foreclose, and this greatly angered the farmers. And one of those farmers was a Revolutionary War veteran named Daniel Shays, who organized, and he wasn't a great military leader. He was something like a sergeant or something, which means he was a decent soldier, but nothing spectacular. So Shays is angry, and he rallies a bunch of other farmers and a bunch of other people who are being suppressed or oppressed by this new constitution, and they march on Springfield, Massachusetts, which is the capital of Massachusetts, and they basically shut down the government. They shut down all the judicial proceedings and the foreclosure proceedings. They shut down the government and demand a change in the taxation burden and and demand the stopping of the foreclosing on farms. And you've got the Massachusetts legislature who doesn't know what to do, and so they would call out a militia to stop them, but most of the militia is in Shays' Rebellion, and so they send word to the national government, come help us. We've got this insurrection on our hands, and of course the Articles of Confederation Congress is going to say what? Well, you don't pay taxes, you don't give us any power to establish an army, we can't help you at all, you're on your own. So Massachusetts had to hire a private militia to put down this rebellion. Of course, there wasn't much bloodshed. Once the militia was formed to put it down, everything kind of scattered. But it did strike fear into the elites of all the states, not just Massachusetts, because and it made them understood the need for a stronger national government. And here's why. Many of these elites, many of these, well, they're all very wealthy people. And the greatest fear of wealthy people is to lose their wealth. And an even greater fear of wealthy people is to lose their wealth to the poor, that the poor, take it away from them, that they overwhelm them and take it away. And what they saw with Shays' Rebellion is they saw a mediocre, if not, bad military leader organize a militia and completely take over a state with just maybe 12 1500 farmers with muskets and pitchforks, and they took over and shut down an entire state. And the great fear was, and they said to themselves, well, what would happen if instead of being Daniel Shays, it was some charismatic, brilliant military leader, and instead of 1200 to 1500 soldiers, it was 10 or 20 or 30,000. If that happened, there's no way they could stop them. They could take over every single state in the nation, and there's no strong central authority to stop them. So basically, it was that Shays' Rebellion that put fear into the elites of the states, and will force them to change the national government to one that is much more powerful and has the ability to actually govern.